Why does America usually win the wars that it's found itself engaged in? And the answer to that is partly embedded in the larger question of the Western way of war. We in the United States have inherited a Western paradigm of making war, and essentially it runs something like this. We have inherited the classical traditions of constitutional government, free market capitalism, secularism, civilian control of the military, and emphasis on individual freedom and liberty. When you apply those values to the battlefield over some 2,500 years of conflict across time and space, it's led to a lethal manner of fighting, superior discipline, high technology, civilian control over the military, highly individualistic and flexible soldiers on the battlefield, logistics that are usually superior to the enemy. And the result of that meant in history that on any given day, the usual criteria for why one side wins or loses a war, and let's think of them, they're numbers, distance from home, weather, the presence or absence of a genius like Napoleon or Hannibal, all of those become a little bit more secondary. In other words, the Western paradigm, if you're Cortez, means you can still win even though you're 6,000 miles away from Madrid in Tenochtitlan, Mexico. Or it means that the British Army can still win if they're in the middle of Africa fighting the Zulus, even though all of the immediate factors are at their disadvantage. Let's pause for a second. So America is the inheritor of the Western tradition, both civilian and military. But it's a little bit different. There is an American way of war that separates our military from that of Germany, from that of France, from that of Britain, that are co-inheritors of the Western tradition. Now, what is the unique American calculus? Well, there's a certain number of factors that have made us different. One of them, of course, is that we have a unique constitution. Unlike the European Union Constitution or the common laws that's been handed down through the British parliamentary system, we put a high emphasis on freedom and individuality. We have a Bill of Rights, and we have this notion that the individual not just has responsibilities to the state, but he has individual rights. And so our soldiers are highly individualistic, they're outspoken, they demand to know why they are ordered to do something. Second factor that makes Americans unique, and its military in particular different from other European powers, is that we were a frontier people. We came to this vast continent of some 3,000 miles, and immediately we were faced with expansion, the opportunity for expansion, I should say. And so whether it was railroads or telegraphs or telephones or highways or gasoline engines, we were very comfortable with technology. And we took an invention from Europe and we refined it and improved it, or we created one out of our own. Whatever the technology was, we felt comfortable with it. We were a highly mobile, restless people who were always going from one frontier to the next till we reached the goal of manifest destiny on the West Coast. Out of that paradigm, Americans grew up with guns on the frontier, they grew up with machines, they grew up with cars, they grew up with locomotives. And when they applied that experience to war, they found out that not just had the Constitution that made them highly individualistic, but they relied on machines. They were always trying to figure out new methods of munitions and explosives and transportation. They were mechanized people in a way that Europeans were not to the same degree. That was a second factor. The third was, very quickly in our history, the old notion that an Anglo-American race was constantly being redefined by Germans, by Irish, by Eastern Europeans, by Southern Europeans, by blacks, by Hispanics. And so very quickly, America became a multiracial society. And it became a very informal society, and it had a vibrant popular culture. And the notion was that it was not aristocratic. It didn't have a military class that by fact of birth or landed holdings or education or parentage could exercise authority. So we had officers coming up from the masses. We were a nation, let's face it, the common people. We put all of those factors together, and there's a distinctive American way of war. And we can look at that through the 5 wars that we fought as a people. In the last 236 years, we've declared war 5 times. The War of 1812, the Mexican War, the Spanish-American War, World War I, and World War II. Altogether, it's been not much more than a decade of our existence. over 2 1/3 centuries. But nevertheless, we have wars that we can look at, and we won every one of them. We defeated the British at the Battle of New Orleans. We defeated the Mexicans from 1846 to 1848. In the 6 or 7 months of the Spanish-American War, we were victorious. We added territories as diverse as the Caribbean to the Philippines. We came in late to World War I in April of 1917. By 1918, we had transported 1 million men across the seas to Europe, hadn't lost one, and we were a big factor in why the British and French won when they did in the fall of 1918. World War II, we're attacked by the Japanese. Hitler declares war. 3.5 years later, we defeat our enemies with the help of our allies, of course. So we have a great record. In addition to these 5 wars, we find ourselves in authorized wars, but without a formal declaration of war. These are things like fighting the Barbary pirates at the beginning of the 19th century, or the 1958 invasion of Lebanon, or the Korean War from 1950 to 1953, or the war in Vietnam from 1963 to 1975. And in these wars, except for Vietnam, we've been pretty successful. We were able to stop the absorption of South Korea by communist North Korea with the help of the Chinese. We were able to stop the disintegration of Lebanon. And if we add to this corpus of examples minor operations where we simply invaded or bombed a country, and that could be as diverse as Haiti or Serbia or Panama or Grenada, we did pretty well. We have examples to adjudicate why America does pretty well, given its unique characteristics and its larger background within the Western paradigm. So why do we do well? The answer is that we have developed what I would call a style of annihilation, a war of annihilation. And the American mentality, being a restless, free, informal people, the notion was always find the enemy, destroy him, and get back home. We're not a militaristic people. We don't have a militaristic culture. We don't feel comfortable with war. We're separate people. We make war reluctantly. We're isolationists, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the result is that when we go to war, we try to apply manpower, technology, create overwhelming supplies, lethal weaponry, and find the enemy and destroy him. That's perhaps best exemplified with the career of U.S. Grant. Remember that when he took control of the Army of the Potomac in March, he was marching by May against Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia in the spring and summer of 1864. And a series of horrific encounters at the Wilderness, Cold Harbor, Spotsylvania Courthouse, Petersburg. As Grant termed it, I'm going to fight along this line all summer, or as he was ordered to do by President Lincoln, wherever Lee goes, you go. Grant wore down the Army of Northern Virginia. He never took Richmond, but he destroyed the Army by a series of hammer blows. In World War I, when the Americans came in late in April of 1917, the question in Europe was, what will we do with this great resource? The Americans have an enormous population, they're the greatest economy in the world. They don't know much about war. They're not a warlike people, but how do we use this resource? Of course, the British were exhausted. The French were exhausted. They had tried to open a secondary front in Gallipoli to knock Turkey out of the war. They were thinking about fighting maybe in Italy, but the question was, we are exhausted on the Western Front in trench warfare. The Americans come in and say, basically, our tradition is that we don't like being here. We have a lot of supplies. We have a lot of men. We have a lot of technology. We have a lot of explosives, we have a lot of ammunition. There are the Germans, we're going to go fight them. So General Pershing has this enormous American expeditionary force. He's advised by General Foch, General Pétain, General Haig. Perhaps it would not be wise to engage in a series of frontal assaults. No matter, that's exactly what we do. We lose 117,000 men in about a year, but we help to break the back of the German Imperial Army. World War II comes along, same issue arises. We're late, we didn't want to get involved, we're not militarized, we're not prepared, we're not mobilized. The war has been going on since 1939. It's now December of 1941. We get involved, Hitler declares war on us. Immediately the same issue arises about the American way of war. The British say you cannot fight the Wehrmacht. It's been fighting in Russia. It's been fighting since 1939, whether the Panzer Mark IV tank or the ME-109 or the 88 millimeter gun. They have superior technology. They have horrific divisions, the Das Reich division, the Hermann Göring division, the SS Adolf Hitler division. They know how to fight. They're professionals. They're part of a Nazi militarized culture. They're going to chew you up. Let's fight on the periphery. Let's go into North Africa. Let's go into Sicily. Let's go into Italy. Let's do anything but get on the continent and find ourselves in the type of knockdown, drag-out fight that's going on in the Eastern Front between the Wehrmacht and the Red Army. And the American attitude, of course, is no. There's some compromises. We try going into Morocco and Algeria and Libya, North Africa, we're successful. We go into Sicily, we're successful. We go into Italy, not so successful. But the urge all the time is to open a second front, even if prematurely so. And so we land in Normandy, and the point of General Eisenhower, he tells Montgomery, he tells Bradley, and they tell their division, their armored corps commanders, General Hodges, General Patton, there is the enemy, go find him and engage him in a series of battles that will destroy his will to resist in the manner that Pershing did and the manner Grant did. We could go on, but you get the idea that the American way of war is annihilation. And we can see it in the skies over Europe. We create the B-17 Flying Fortress, the B-24 Liberator, the B-29 Super Fortress. And the idea is there's the enemy source of supply of manpower. We're going to destroy it and annihilate it. And then the war will be over and we'll get to go home very quickly. That works pretty well if, and this is a big if the enemy is willing to fight us in a conventional manner. But unfortunately, a lot of enemies understand the American strength, that it can raise armies, it can train them very quickly, it has enormous logistical support, and it has a vast array of deadly weaponry. And therefore, they don't want to confront it in a conventional battlefield. So what do? They try to look for different modes of fighting. And we, in response, try to find different modes ourselves. So as early as the Civil War, while Grant was trying to get to Richmond through the strategy of annihilation, we developed another alternative, secondary American strategy. It was very successful, called the strategy of attrition. So William Tecumseh Sherman's going to leave Tennessee, but he's not going to engage Joe Johnston on his way to Atlanta, Georgia. He's going to outflank them, outflank them, outflank them. And this army is going to go around and take Atlanta from the rear and not lose people. And it did exactly that. September 2nd, Sherman takes Atlanta and says, Mr. President, Atlanta is ours and fairly won. Lincoln wins the election 6 to 8 weeks later in November. What does Sherman do? Does he go out and seek out John Bell Hood's army? No. He says, I'm going to Savannah, takes out this enormous army on November 17th, and for the next 35 days, he slices right through the middle of the Confederacy through central Georgia. Again, the idea is to terrorize the enemy, get behind enemy lines, destroy property, etc., but not meet the enemy head on, not the way Grant is doing. He gets to Savannah and create a war of, I guess we could call it total war, a war of terror, a war of psychology, whatever term we want to use, to destroy and undermine the civilian population. This is very important. It also suggests that America, this alternate method of warfare, when used in concert with the war of annihilation, gives us a great advantage. And you see it in World War II, why Montgomery is going into the Ruhr, why Hodges is going head-on against central Germany. George Patton starts up the Third Army around the end of July of 1944. He's supposed to take the Brittany Peninsula in the west. He decides instead to go east. And this emphasis on mobility leads to something like George Patton at the head of the Third Army in summer 1944, advancing at phenomenal rates of 20, 30, 40 miles per day in a series of enormous envelopments. The Falaise Gap outside of Paris, on the way to the Lorraine. Suddenly, Patton, the army is getting up to near 1 million people. It's traveling at a rapid rate. 9 months later, it's into Czechoslovakia, into Germany. Patton captures more German prisoners, loses fewer Americans than any other comparable American. People criticize him because he's not like U.S. Grant, or he's not like General Hodges, not like the British under General Montgomery, but he's got this second idea of a war of attrition through mobility, outflanking the enemy, creating a sense, a psychology of imminent collapse, and it's quite successful. And this second strategy also reflects the American character. Just like we're impatient and we like to destroy things and we like to build machines and use men and seek out the enemy in a frontier clash, by the same time we're highly mobile. We like to move. 18-year-olds take apart a Model A or Model T. They know what a generator is. They know what a starter is. You give them a Sherman tank, an 18-year-old, he likes to drive it. It breaks down, he can fix it. Americans like simple, easily accessible machines. It's not Germany, where you have a craft guild and you have a Panther tank and you take out the transmission, you spend 2 days trying to refine it with these very close tolerances. You turn a bunch of 18-year-olds loose in a Sherman tank, they can have the transmission out in 2 hours, fix it, put it back in, they're on their way to Germany. We see it in the first and second Gulf Wars. The big hook around Saddam's army in 1991 was very successful, and then in March of 2003, the Americans land from Kuwait, and 21 days later, they're up to the Kurdish border. Movement, 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 movement. It was no accident that the first campaign was called Cobra II. That was in direct emulation of the initial breakout in World War II called Cobra I. So we have two traditions, and we alternate between one or the other, and that's been very successful. We also have a third, because as I said, a lot of enemies don't want to fight us head on, and they're wise to the idea that even in a conventional war they could be outflanked, so they choose a third and alternate war, and that is not to fight conventionally at all, to stay in their cities, to stay in jungles, not to encounter American firepower. If you're in Vietnam, you would be stupid to go find a clear patch of ground and to create a formal army and to engage Americans head on and be vulnerable to American firepower, air power, conventional infantry. If you're in Afghanistan today, you do not want to come down from the highlands and use antiquated Soviet equipment and engage the American 1st Armored Division or 1st Marine Division. If you're in Iraq, Saddam Hussein, who quite foolishly delivered up his army on a platter and had it destroyed in the First and Second Gulf Wars, is going to be followed by a second generation of far brighter commanders, insurgents, al-Qaeda, Islamicists, who will not fight in that manner. And so this third way of the American way of war is we find ourselves in a place where we don't want to be, forced to fight in a manner that we don't feel comfortable with, and yet we still can often win. So we try to win hearts and minds. We try to pour American money, American machines at the use of the population. We build electrical grids, sewer plants, water pumping stations. We try to use anthropologists, sociologists, the vast engine of American higher education. We try to understand the tribal formations, the tribal allegiances, the tribal nature of our enemies, and then we try to use the same type of warfare that they use, but we use it against them. The United States has tried to find a method of American warfare within the larger landscape of the Western military superior tradition that allows us to win wars. And we've been very good at it because the strategy of annihilation, the strategy of attrition, and counterinsurgency strategy has all embodied what Americans are very adept at. Machines, technology, mobility, using capital, education, research, whether it's finding the enemy in a set-piece battle or maneuvering around his rear in a rapid march, or fighting in counterinsurgency. Some of our enemies realize that among all of these advantages and strengths that we bring to warfare, we also bring some disadvantages. The American people have developed these ways of fighting because they're very impatient. Again, we don't border a major continent like Asia or Europe or Africa. We're not a Mediterranean people where wars tend to take place in history. We're isolated. We're highly democratic. Market capitalism, when combined with the nature of American freedom, creates a leisured, affluent citizen. We don't like militarism in general. We're not an aristocratic society. In other words, we have a very limited patience for war and the cost of war. And when we find ourselves in counterinsurgency operations that, unlike conventional wars, cannot be ended quickly by the strategy of annihilation or attrition, and we must engage in counterinsurgency, we have a limited patience with it. So after 10 years in Afghanistan, after 11 years in Vietnam, after 7 years in Iraq, 12 years in the Philippines, the Americans want to end it. Which brings up, I think, to conclude, what's the future of the American way of war? I think we're starting to see in the 21st century a fourth modality, I don't know how to call it, what I should call it. Maybe something as informal as more rubble, less trouble. In other words, Americans will use air power and sea power and from a distance attack a country, perhaps the way we did against Mr. Milosevic in Serbia, perhaps the way Ronald Reagan did in Libya or Barack Obama did in Libya, with the expectation that because we do not have the patience to nation build, we cannot find ourselves in a conventional war, we're not going to get on the ground at all. Yes, we can defend South Korea from North Korea, but we don't think North Korea is going to fight in a conventional way. We can defend Europe from a resurgent Russia if we must, but we don't think Russia will fight in a conventional way. To do so is suicide. So what we're developing is a way of fighting an unconventional war without subjecting American troops to the types of issues that make the public very suspicious that we can win. And so I think the future of the American way of war is to stay out of a Libya, stay out of a Syria, stay out of Iran, but find a mechanism to use superior American power to defeat the enemy without incurring not just American losses, but without incurring American contact with the enemy. And that's going to be the next, I think, the next page in the long history of American warfare.